So I've been, like everyone else, wrestling with the question of where we find ourselves in the aftermath of what I think was clearly an insurrection on the part of most of the people. That is a self-diagnosis, I would say, or consistent with the self-diagnosis of many of the people who stormed the Capitol. For those who want to know more about what it looked like on the ground, I would advise people check in with the interview I did with Jeremy Lee Quinn, who was a journalist who was not only on the ground at the Capitol, but went into the Capitol and reported firsthand. He's got fascinating stuff on his website, and you can get a real sense for what it felt like on the ground, which is something that is missing from most of the mainstream coverage. But what I see in the aftermath of that event is a lot of people making political moves. That is to say, I see a lot of advocacy for various positions. Some of the positions I think are in the interests of the nation, but I see most of the motivation that appears to be driving people, even to suggest things that I would agree with, appears to be about jockeying for position in a very traditional way. And I don't think that's appropriate given where we find ourselves here at the beginning of 2021. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to speak to what I think is the patriotic center. I've said many times I'm not a centrist, but the center is where we meet to discuss the interests of the nation and to figure out where to go. And this, if there was ever a time when we need to meet in the center and discuss what is in our collective interests, it's now. So what I see is that we are faced with various exotic remedies to a situation. I would say the three exotic remedies that seem to be present are the 25th Amendment, impeachment, which has already happened, and pardons. Those are the exotic remedies. And then there's a question about how they might be wielded and to what end. And of course, each of them carries various implications for the future. And what I would suggest, in fact, what I think we should demand from our leaders, is that they step outside of their tribalistic team allegiances and start thinking about what the implications of their actions are going to be. Now, I would say, I would certainly ask that people, in listening to my suggestion, my proposal here, that people put judgment aside, because we have each been trained to look for evidence that somebody is on the opposing side. And as soon as we get that evidence, we jump. Now, my feeling is what needs to be done here is not going to make anyone perfectly happy, but that the most important thing on the table is protected if we act courageously and carefully. So my proposal would be, starting with the impeachment, which has already happened, that the House impeach the president. I want to see the Senate come back into session and convict the president. I believe that is not only justified by the merits of the case, but it is also very definitely in the nation's interest. It is in the nation's interest in the sense that if President Trump is not convicted, he remains eligible to run in 2024. And I believe what we will see is effectively a 4-year campaign for Trump to return to office. Now, no matter what you think about Donald Trump, I would say it is absolutely clear that he is not the person to unite the nation. He did have special skills that allowed him to beat the Republican Party and ascend to the highest office in the land, but he did not have the skills to make use of that office to bring us into some new era. And that's tragic, but I think it is very clear, and that the insurrection at the end of his term is evidence of that. So to the extent that we may need somebody to escape the duopoly's grasp, it isn't going to be Donald Trump, and it won't be Donald Trump in 2024. And the idea that we are going to live under the shadow of that possibility for the next 4 years should frighten all of us. Now, I see Republicans playing with the idea of convicting Trump, but at some level, it's hard to avoid the impression that the Senate Republicans are simply weighing the hazard to them politically of convicting Trump against the possibility that many consider desirable of being free of his influence over the next 4 years. So I would like to see them convict him, but I would also like to see them do it as a matter of partnership. And frankly, this is what I see missing from the larger discussion, is a partnership between the various players in this. In other words, I would like to have seen the House collaborate with the Senate. I would like to have seen Democrats collaborate with Republicans. I would like to see the Senate now, in partnership with Vice President Pence, agree that Donald Trump must be convicted in order that he cannot run in 2024, and because what he did do was encourage, although indirectly, the assault on the Capitol, but that Pence, when he assumes the office of president, should pardon President Trump, right? Thereby alleviating the potential for federal prosecution. That, I believe, is the route that is best for the nation. I would also argue that that he would then be President Pence, should pardon all of the insurrectionists who did not engage in direct violence against other human beings, as well as the BLM protesters who did not involve themselves in direct violence against other human beings. Now, this may all seem very radical and strange, but there is clear precedent for this. Zach, could you put up it's the Federalist paper, the Hamilton Federalist paper that I sent you? Okay, so I should say I was pointed to this by a friend of ours, Ramsey Rammerman, who is a lawyer and quite well schooled in this. He points me to this last paragraph of what is Federalist 74. Is that right, Zach? Does it say that at the top? Scroll back up. Federalist 74 from 1788. And so Hamilton says, on the other hand, when the sedition had proceeded from causes which had inflamed the resentments of the major party, they might often be found obstinate and inexorable. When policy demanded a conduct of forbearance and clemency, but the principal argument for reposing the power of pardoning in this case to the chief magistrate is this: in seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth, and which, if suffered to pass unimproved, it may never be possible afterwards to recall. What he is saying here, so the entirety of this, he writes as Publius here, which is a shared nom de plume of several founders. What he is saying here, the purpose of this Federalist paper, is an argument for vesting the power of the pardon in the single chief executive. Now, in part, so I'm going back through history I don't know terribly well, but in part, Shays' rebellion, which bears some striking resemblance to certain things that have taken place actually on both sides of the political spectrum in the last year. Shays' rebellion was an insurrection that was the result of essentially soldiers, most especially Shays, who found themselves in a debt crisis, not having been paid for their military service. And the result of that insurrection, which was put down by a private army, there was no federal army, the result of that insurrection was to reveal to many of the founders the need for a strong central authority. And Hamilton here is arguing, in part in response to Shays' rebellion, that the power of the pardon is best vested in an individual rather than a committee. And his point effectively is, it's actually parallel to one that you and I have made on the podcast in various places about things like parenting, which is that a system, in order to work well in light of a vast array of possibilities that can't be foreseen when you build it, has to have discretion. Right? Parents cannot just simply lay down rules that result in children growing up well. You have to have discretion about when, to inflict harsh punishment, when to resist that urge. And so Hamilton is making the argument that the interests of the nation involve a single individual who is poised at a particularly critical moment, like the one that we face right now, to deploy the pardon to relieve the pressure that might otherwise tear us apart. And his point is, if you let that moment go, you may never get it back. That's what he's saying in that paragraph.
This certainly seems like such a moment, and the tensions on both sides are incredibly high, and people who have not been engaging in the riots and violence on either side, whatever tribe to which they think they belong, are fairly eager to keep their anger alive and demand vengeance. And this would be a way of preventing such vengeance and of intentionally and permanently putting it in the rearview mirror, putting the possibility of such vengeance in the rearview mirror.
Yes, taking many things off the table. Now, it is complicated by the fact that a pardon of any of these folks only would immunize them from federal prosecution, but it could be done in such a way that it would invite the states to follow suit. And I would advocate for that. And in effect, this does mean that people who have clearly committed criminal acts would, in effect, get away with it. But what I would suggest is that this be done in tandem with an agreement that the rule of law must stand. It must be enforced. It cannot be enforced differentially. And therefore, it should come with a no tolerance policy for violence, rioting, insurrection going forward, right? That is to say, we relieve the pressure with amnesty. And I should say, Shays himself was pardoned. There were it's not as clear as everyone involved in his rebellion, which was, I think, 4,000 people. They were not all pardoned, but in general, all but a few received clemency of one kind or another. So again, this is precedented. And were we to find ourselves in a situation where President Pence had partnered with the Congress, we had eliminated the threat of living under a 4-year campaign of Trump potentially returning to office, Trump and his supporters would also effectively be protected from the spectacle of federal prosecutions of Trump going forward, which are likely to occur under Democratic rule. So all of these things would serve to relieve the pressure. I have the sense you had something you wanted to add there.
I mean, there are a number of things to say. I guess one concern, obviously, is that this would, I believe, do as you suggest, and would relieve the pressure at the governmental and legal level. But as we talked about last week, a lot of what we're seeing is extra-governmental action by private corporations who are effectively acting as in the public good in their own eyes in censoring, for instance, the president and others who the tech companies imagine are dangerous to discourse and civilization.
I agree. And obviously there's a lot to be discussed there, and we should come back to it. It will probably take weeks of looking at different aspects of the puzzle, but there is an awful lot to be said there. But I would say, to the extent that what we have is a ferocious, powerful, and new weapon in the hands of a strangely aligned industry that has a very clear political bent, the last thing that we want to see is that apparatus liberated to behave in an authoritarian way by the fact of Trump attempting to regain the office in 2024. And frankly, I think almost as frightening as the prospect of the 4 years under that is the prospect of the trials unfolding in public view. So to the extent that we can relieve this pressure, we also relieve the justification that the tech sector will use in order to crack down on voices it doesn't like.
I guess I'm not sure about your use of the term liberating. I don't think the tech companies need any liberation to do what they want. Clearly, they already feel plenty free to act as they desire. What I do think this could do, which could very much help change the conversation and alleviate some of the ramping up that is happening, is by taking Trump out of the equation, you immediately remove and put, again, in the rearview mirror, the single source of anger and ire that, call it half of America has, and I don't think it's actually fully half, but, half of America has for someone, and they have pinned, so many people have pinned, and it's the opposite of hopes, like all of their dismay and their the source of everything wrong in the world on this guy. And that's not fair. right? He's definitely culpable for a lot of stuff, but that's not fair. And yet, I was literally walking around downtown Portland this week and overheard two different conversations between two different sets of, it turns out to have been young women. I'm assuming their gender, in in all these cases, but a total of four women who were just gleeful in their rage, and they imagined deserved rage at the second impeachment, which had just happened. I think just then is at the point that I was walking around, and I thought, what happens? What happens to their conversations, and what happens to their personalities, and what happens to their imaginations and plans for the future at the point that the single enemy in their world goes away? We can hope that some number of these people actually return to a semblance of thinking more clearly, more broadly about a range of issues. Now, I don't think, listening to your conversation with Jeremy Lee Quinn, your second one, the almost 3-hour one that was just posted last week, he says there are plenty of people. He doesn't say there are plenty of people. He says there are those who are arguing really for anarchy and for destruction at any cost. It doesn't matter from whom or for what, it doesn't matter. So those people will not be appeased. And those people are very dangerous, and they've been very active on the so-called left since the beginning of the summer. And he was suggesting somewhat present also in the insurrection on the Capitol last week, 2 weeks ago, week and a half ago. So those people won't be helped by this, but there are a whole lot of people who are just so focused on the one enemy that if you take away that enemy, maybe they could recover.
Well, yes, I think this is central, which is that these fringes are driving the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And so two things have to be true. I hope it was clear in what I said at the top that amnesty for what has happened in the past, coming with an insistence on the rule of law going forward, is key. And I would point out rule of law is the apolitical way of saying this, that Trump has politicized the question by saying law and order all the time, which is typically a right-wing thing. But rule of law is something we all ought to be able to agree on. It is essential to the functioning of our society.
Actually, someone, I think I saw in our Q&A last week, a question we hadn't gotten to, a suggestion that rule of law and law and order were wrestle conjugations of one another. So this is basically what you've just said.
I believe they are.
Yeah.
I don't know if they were. I mentioned this on the trigonometry podcast just right after the insurrection had happened. But so I want to make a couple last points, one of them quite concordant with what you just said. So the fringes are indeed driving the conversation for others. And it occurred to me listening to Eric on the Hill program Rising a couple days ago. Maybe it was yesterday even. He mentions what he calls Magistan and Wokistan. And these are the two fringes in question. And it occurred to me that something I have been saying since the beginning, since before Trump was elected, that the problem with this slogan MAGA is that it is intentionally polarizing, and it's the second A in MAGA that does it. The idea that America should be made great again suggests all sorts of things. It suggests that it has been great. Now, I think it is a country with a tremendous amount of greatness to it, but I don't think it has ever been great for everybody. I don't think it's ever been great for blacks. I don't think it's ever been great for Indians. And until it's great for everybody, it isn't great. It's a prototype of great. So by saying again, it sort of suggests that we had it and somebody screwed it up, and now we're looking for villains. But what occurred to me in hearing Eric invoke Magistan and Wokistan was that it is the exact desire to misunderstand the past all the way, to turn your misunderstanding to 11 in one of two directions, that creates these yin-yang fringes, right? So the MAGA folks are trying to get us back to somewhere that we never were, right? And the Wokistan folks are essentially arguing that this country is bad at its core, that that's what it was founded to do, that there is no possibility of making it great. Therefore, tearing it down is the only reasonable action. And the point is, both of these things are equally crazy, right? The country was never great in the sense of great for all populations. It certainly has marched a long way in that direction. We have made tremendous progress, but we're not there. And it is reasonable to demand that we get there. It is not reasonable to want to go back, and it is not reasonable to tear it down on the basis that it's such an evil place that we will almost inevitably do better if we try again. That's utter nonsense. So recognizing the insanity of these two positions, and therefore the necessity to alleviate their control over the discussion. How do we
Yes.
alleviate their control? By sidelining them at this moment and saying, okay, what's happened has happened. What must happen going forward is the law must be enforced, irrespective of who it is who's breaking it. And, that period of relief makes a great deal of sense.
I guess I'm surprised I'm this guy at this point, but I'm concerned that alleviating the pressure, taking away some of the remaining power insofar as it exists, excuse me, from the MAGA people leaves much of the power that is, like I said, extra governmental, and of course there's plenty of governmental power as well among the Wokostanders, if you will, that not just the tech companies, but obviously media and much else, and in corporate America are at least virtue signaling, putting up their whether it's "don't hurt me" walls, or they actually have people in their HR departments who believe this stuff, or anything in between, from academia to corporations to media. The majority of what we are expected to believe is very much slanted towards Wokistan rather than Magistan. And, we're arguing we shouldn't have either. But, how is it that we actually disempower both of those things?
Well, I think this is a great point, and I think it ought to be our focus. But in part, I think we also need to understand that we don't exactly know why we are where we are. In other words, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that has, the tech sector, which is ostensibly a bunch of corporations in competition with each other, behaving as if they are one monster.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what the interaction is between that entity and our governmental structures. For one thing, we've in part lost control of our governmental structures. There's the part we can see and there's the part we can't. And actually, this brings me to what I would say is the last piece of the puzzle that I would hope to see deployed in the next few days before the inauguration, which is I would hope to see the pardon of Snowden and Assange. Now, Snowden, I would say, is a national hero for what he did, for bringing transparency where there was authoritarianism and opacity. It's harder to say that about Assange because he's not an American, but nonetheless, I would hope to see those pardons. And frankly, if I had all of the cards to play of all the various players, I would probably have Trump pardon them before he is convicted by the Senate, as an indication that actually, he is willing to do his part for the well-being of the nation, even in his wounded condition. So anyway, I don't know what will come of this. I frankly expect nothing will come of it because these actors are so political. They're dyed-in-the-wool partisans. And so the idea that they would ever do anything that wasn't justified by its immediately elevating them relative to their competitors is almost hard to imagine.
And at some level, partisanship is the opposite of patriotism.
It is. Yeah, that's very well said. It is the opposite of patriotism. Patriotism is about putting your interests aside in the interest of something larger, a nation, for example. And so it's a rare commodity these days, but who knows? Maybe they will surprise us in a positive direction. If nothing else, they should look at the prospect of a future lived under the cloud of either a 4-year campaign by Trump to regain the office or a long series of highly publicized and charged trials of President Trump. Neither of those things are going to leave us better off as a nation, and anybody who says otherwise is a liar, frankly.